Close your eyes. Imagine standing on a hill at dusk. The air is warm and dry. Below you, a city spreads out in every direction. Temples of white marble catching the last light of the sun. Broad stone roads carrying the hum of daily life. And somewhere in the distance, the low murmur of the river that gave this civilization its first drink of water. You are standing on the Palatine Hill. The year, depending on who you ask, is somewhere around 750 before the Common Era. And below you, barely more than a cluster of mud and thatch huts along a muddy bend of the Tiber, is the city that will one day call itself the center of the known world. This is Rome. Not the Rome of marble statues and triumphal arches. Not yet. That Rome is still centuries away, still waiting in the stone of far-off quarries. Tonight, we are going to travel through the entire arc of this city's extraordinary life, from its very first campfires to its long, slow twilight, and along the way, we are going to discover that almost everything you think you know about Rome is incomplete. Did you know that the famous Roman toga, symbol of power and civilization, was actually considered cumbersome and impractical by most Romans, who preferred to wear it as rarely as possible? Did you know that Rome once had a female gladiator class? That Roman soldiers were forbidden from entering the city limits while armed? That Julius Caesar was not technically the first dictator of Rome? And that he never held the title of emperor? We will answer all of these questions tonight. But there is no rush. History, like sleep, rewards the patient traveler. So let us begin at the very beginning, in the shadows before Rome had a name. Long before the Romans, another civilization ruled the Italian peninsula. Who were they, and what did they leave behind? Italy, before it became Roman, was a patchwork of peoples. In the north, a mysterious and sophisticated culture called the Etruscans had built walled cities, developed a written language, and created art of startling beauty. Art that the Romans would one day absorb, imitate, and quietly claim as their own. We know surprisingly little about the Etruscans. Their language, though written, has only been partially decoded. They left behind no great literary works that survived, only tombs. Bright, colorful tombs painted with scenes of feasting, music, and dancing, as though the dead were expected to continue the party indefinitely. One of the remarkable things about Etruscan society, and one of those lesser-known facts that tends to surprise people, is that Etruscan women enjoyed a freedom almost unparalleled in the ancient world. They attended public banquets alongside men. They were educated. Their names were recorded. Greek travelers were so scandalized by Etruscan women's behavior that they wrote about it in disapproving terms, which tells us, of course, that these women were living lives the Greeks could barely imagine. To the south, Greek colonists had settled what they called Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, bringing with them their gods, their philosophy, their architecture, their love of argument and theater. The boot of Italy was in many ways more Greek than Rome would ever be. And in the middle, along a yellow river called the Tiber, a loose confederation of Latin-speaking tribes occupied the rolling hills. They were farmers mostly, shepherds, people who tracked the seasons, honored their ancestors, and buried their dead with care. These are the people from whom Rome would eventually emerge. Not with a grand plan, not with divine destiny written in the stars, but slowly, the way a river carves a canyon, 1 year, 1 generation, one small decision at a time. The Romans told a founding myth involving twin brothers raised by a wolf. But what did they actually believe about this story? And what does archaeology tell us instead? Every civilization needs a creation story, a moment of beginning that explains not just how a city was built, but why it deserves to exist at all. Rome's founding myth is one of the strangest and most violent in the ancient world. It begins with a Trojan prince named Aeneas, who, after the fall of Troy, sailed across the Mediterranean carrying his aged father on his back and his household gods in his arms. After many adventures that the poet Virgil would one day describe in his great epic, the Aeneid, Aeneas and his descendants settled in Latium on the western coast of Italy. Generations passed, and then 2 twin brothers were born, Romulus and Remus, sons of a Vestal virgin and the god Mars himself. Their great uncle, fearing the prophecy that they would one day overthrow him, ordered them thrown into the Tiber River. But they did not drown. The basket carrying them came to rest at the foot of the Palatine Hill, where a she-wolf, a lupa, found them and suckled them as her own. A woodpecker, sacred to Mars, brought them food. A shepherd named Faustulus eventually discovered them and raised them as his sons. When they grew to manhood, the twins overthrew their great-uncle, restored their grandfather to power, and then decided to found a new city of their own. They disagreed on the location. They decided to let the gods choose, watching the sky for omens in the form of birds. Romulus, on the Palatine Hill, saw 12 vultures. Remus, on the Aventine, saw only 6. Romulus won. He began to mark out the boundary of his new city with a plow. And then, in an act of founding violence that the Romans never quite explained away, he killed his brother. The details vary. Some say Remus jumped over Romulus's sacred wall in mockery, and Romulus killed him in rage. Others say the killing was carried out by a follower. But the result is the same. Rome was born in fratricide. The city was baptized in the blood of a brother. Here is the lesser-known part that scholars find fascinating. The Romans themselves were deeply uncomfortable with this story. They told it. They couldn't not tell it. It was too embedded in their culture, because. But they kept trying to soften it, explain it, justify it. It haunted them. And some historians argue that this unresolved founding wound explains a great deal about Roman political violence throughout the centuries that followed. Now here is what archaeology actually tells us. Rome was not founded in a single moment by a single man. The hills along the Tiber were occupied by small, separate communities for centuries before anything we could call Rome existed. The city coalesced gradually, through alliance, intermarriage, and conquest, somewhere between the 10th and 8th centuries BCE. There was no Romulus. But there may have been something like him. A strongman, a war chief, a figure around whom the scattered settlements finally unified. The Romans, when they later tried to calculate the year of their city's founding, settled on 753 BCE. They called it year 1 of their calendar, Anno Urbis Conditi, the year of the founded city. And they counted every year forward from that point. It is a date that feels like a heartbeat, a beginning. Rome was a kingdom long before it was a republic. Who were these early kings? And why does history remember so few of their names? After Romulus, if we follow the traditional story, Rome was governed by kings. 7 of them, across roughly 2.5 centuries. And they are among the most shadowy figures in all of ancient history. Half legend, half man, and yet each one left a fingerprint on the city that outlasted them by 1,000 years. The second king, Numa Pompilius, is perhaps the most interesting of them. He was chosen not because of his military power, but because of his wisdom and his piety. The Romans believed that Numa received divine instruction directly from a water nymph named Egeria, whom he met each night in a sacred grove. From these nocturnal meetings, Numa reportedly built the entire religious calendar of Rome, the system of sacred days, festivals, months, and rituals that would govern Roman life for centuries. He established the priesthoods. He created the College of Vestal Virgins. He is credited with adding January and February to what had been a 10-month calendar. Now here is something worth pausing on. The Romans inherited their calendar from Numa, and through the Romans, we inherited it too. The months of January and February exist because a legendary Roman king reportedly received divine instruction from a nymph in a moonlit grove. The year you live in is still, in part, shaped by that midnight conversation. The kings that followed ranged from builders to warriors. Tullus Hostilius was a man of perpetual war who reportedly called down lightning on himself by conducting a ritual incorrectly. Ancus Marcius expanded Rome to the sea, building the port of Ostia. Tarquinius Priscus was an Etruscan immigrant, or the son of one, who transformed Rome from a village of mud brick huts into something approaching a proper city, draining the marshy ground between the hills to create the great open space that would become the Roman Forum. His successor, Servius Tullius, reorganized Roman society from the ground up, creating the class divisions, the census, the voting assemblies that would define Roman civic life for centuries. He built the first great wall around the city, and then he was murdered, by his own daughter and son-in-law. The last king was Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. He was, in the Roman telling, a tyrant in the truest ancient sense, a man who seized power through violence, governed through fear, and finally fell because of a rape. His son, Sextus Tarquinius, assaulted a noble Roman woman named Lucretia. She told her husband and father what had happened, made them swear revenge, and then killed herself. Because Roman society, armed with its merciless logic about honor, left her no other choice. The Romans rose up, the Tarquin family was expelled, and in the year 509 BCE, according to Roman tradition, the Republic was born. No more kings, ever again. The Romans were so traumatized by the memory of monarchy that the word rex, king, became a slur. A Roman politician could be destroyed simply by being accused of wanting to be king. This fear of kings would shape Roman politics for 500 years, and it would, in an irony that the Romans could not quite see coming, ultimately produce the most powerful monarchy in Western history. The Roman Republic is often called the birthplace of democracy. But was it? Who actually held power, and who was left out entirely? The Roman Republic was not a democracy in the modern sense. It was something stranger and more complicated. A system designed, above all, to prevent any single person from accumulating too much power. The Romans had seen what kings did, and they were determined not to repeat it. At the top of the system sat two consuls, elected each year, who held the executive power of the old kings. But here was the crucial innovation. Each consul could veto the other. The Latin word for this was intercessio, literally stepping between. One man's ambition was always checked by another man's ambition. Below the consuls, a growing web of offices managed the affairs of the state. Praetors who oversaw the courts, censors who conducted the census and guarded public morality, quaestors who managed the treasury, aediles who maintained the city's buildings, roads, and grain supply, and a senate of 300 men who guided foreign policy and controlled the public finances. This system worked, more or less, for 5 centuries, but it contained a flaw that the Romans could see clearly and could not fix. It was designed for a city-state, not an empire. Here is a remarkable and little-known aspect of Roman civic life. The Roman Senate had no legal power to pass laws. The Senate issued what were called senatus consulta, decrees, recommendations. But they were not automatically law. They had to be approved by the popular assemblies. This means that technically, throughout the Republican period, the Roman people had the final word on legislation. In practice, of course, wealth, patronage, and influence meant that the Roman people in these assemblies were not voting as equals. But the legal framework was more democratic than most people realize. And then there were the plebeians, the common people, the non-aristocrats, the vast majority of Romans, who spent the first 2 centuries of the Republic in open conflict with the patrician elite. This struggle, called the conflict of the orders, produced some of the most interesting political innovations in Roman history. The plebeians at several points simply left. They walked out of Rome, all of them, en masse, and sat down on a hill outside the city walls, refusing to work, refusing to fight, refusing to participate in civic life until their demands were met. This tactic, which modern labor movements would one day call a general strike, worked. And the patricians could not run the city without the plebeians. Slowly, through these secessions and negotiations, the plebeians won the right to their own assembly, their own elected officers called tribunes, and eventually the right to hold the highest offices of state. The tribunes were granted a power that seems almost miraculous in its simplicity: the power of the veto. A tribune of the plebs could stand up anywhere in Rome and say a single word: veto, I forbid it, and any action by any magistrate would be legally suspended. The tribune's person was declared sacrosanct, untouchable. To lay a hand on a tribune was to invite the wrath of the gods. This was the Republic at its best, a system genuinely trying to balance power, to protect the weak from the strong, to build something that would last. It would last 500 years, be long enough to conquer the known world, and long enough to destroy itself. Forget the emperors and the battles for a moment. What was daily life actually like for an ordinary Roman? And how different was it from what the movies show us? Let us leave the Senate House for a while and walk through the city. It is morning in Rome. The sun has barely cleared the hills to the east, and already the streets are thunderous. The Romans banned wheeled vehicles from the city during daylight hours. The traffic was simply too terrible, which meant that merchants and builders had to deliver their goods at night. So from dusk until dawn, the streets rang with the rattle of wagon wheels over stone, the shouts of drivers, the cursing of pedestrians jolted awake. The Roman satirist Juvenal wrote that a man who could sleep in Rome must have a remarkable constitution. The Romans had a fast food culture that would be entirely recognizable today. Every Roman city was full of thermopolia, establishments where a counter of stone or concrete contained large clay pots sunk into the surface, kept warm from below, filled with prepared food. Lentil stew, spiced wine, chickpeas, bread. You could eat a full meal standing at the counter, pay a few coins, and be on your way. Archaeologists have found hundreds of these in Pompeii alone. Most Romans did not cook at home. The apartment buildings of Rome, called insulae, or islands, were notorious fire hazards, and open flames were strictly limited. The ground floor of an insula might be a fine shop or comfortable apartment. The upper floors, where the poor lived, grew smaller and cheaper and more dangerous with every story. Some insulae rose 6 or 7 stories, the tenement blocks of antiquity. Water did not reach the upper floors. Residents carried buckets from the public fountains below. There were no private toilets on the upper floors. Chamber pots were emptied, discreetly, let us say, into the streets below, which is why no sensible Roman walked close to a building wall. And yet the city was also clean, in ways that often surprise people. Rome had an extensive sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, or Great Drain, whose tunnels still run beneath modern Rome, and public latrines that were genuinely social spaces. Romans sat side by side on rows of stone toilet seats, carried on conversations, did business, gossiped. There was no concept of toilet privacy. None of the Romans would have found our modern bathroom habits bizarre. The bathhouses, the thermae, were the great social equalizers of Roman life. For a fee so small it was nearly free, any Roman citizen could spend an afternoon moving through rooms of progressively warmer water. The frigidarium, the tepidarium, the caldarium, having their skin scraped clean with a curved blade called a strigil, getting massages, swimming in cool pools, and socializing with their neighbors. Some of the great imperial bathhouses could accommodate thousands of people simultaneously. They had libraries, gardens, exercise courts, snack vendors. The Romans also ate lying down, at least the wealthy ones did. A formal Roman dinner party, called a cena, involved reclining on couches arranged around a low central table being served by slaves, or over the course of hours. The food could be extraordinary in its variety and strangeness. Flamingo tongues, dormice fattened in clay pots and rolled in honey and poppy seeds, fish sauce called garum that was made by fermenting fish guts in the sun for weeks and which smelled, reportedly, extraordinary. Here is one of those facts that somehow gets left out of most histories. Roman soldiers' wages were sometimes partially paid in salt, or at least, they were given a salt allowance. The Latin word for salt is sal. From this comes the Latin salarium, a salt payment, from which we derive our word salary. Every time you receive your wages, you are echoing the economy of Roman soldiers on distant frontiers. Rome's greatest enemy was not a nation or an army. It was a single man with elephants and a plan that almost worked. Who was Hannibal Barca, and why did the Romans fear his name for generations? To understand Rome, you must understand Carthage, because Rome spent a century and a half in mortal terror of it. Carthage was a great city on the northern coast of Africa, in what is now Tunisia. It had been founded by Phoenician traders, and it had grown into the dominant commercial power of the Western Mediterranean, controlling the sea lanes, the silver mines of Spain, and the grain of North Africa. Where Rome built roads, Carthage built harbors. Where Rome made soldiers, Carthage made merchants and admirals. The two civilizations were not natural enemies. But Sicily, the great island at the toe of Italy, sat between them like a contested inheritance, and eventually the contest for Sicily became a war. The First Punic War lasted 23 years. Either the Romans, who had no naval tradition to speak of, invented one almost from scratch. They copied a captured Carthaginian warship, built 100 like it, trained crews in fields on land before the ships were even launched, and then, in an act of breathtaking improvisation, added a device to their ships called a corvus, a spiked boarding bridge that dropped onto enemy decks and allowed Roman soldiers to turn a sea battle into a land battle. They won. But Carthage was not finished, and Carthage had the Barca family. Hamilcar Barca had led Carthaginian forces in Sicily and died undefeated in Spain. Before he died, he made his young son swear an oath of eternal enmity against Rome. That son was Hannibal, and he kept his oath. Hannibal's crossing of the Alps in 218 BCE, with an army, cavalry, and a force of war elephants, is one of the most audacious military maneuvers in history. What is less often told is the cost. Hannibal began with roughly 50,000 troops. He arrived in Italy with perhaps 26,000, exhausted, frostbitten, and reduced to slaughtering their own horses for food. And yet this half-frozen, diminished army then proceeded to inflict on Rome three of the worst military defeats in its entire history. At the Battle of Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, where Hannibal arranged an ambush so perfectly that the Romans marched into it in fog, unable to see, and 15,000 of them died in the water before they understood what was happening. And then at Cannae, a battle so catastrophically decisive that military historians still study it today. At Cannae, in 216 BCE, say Hannibal faced a Roman army that outnumbered him significantly. He allowed the center of his line to bend backward under Roman pressure, drawing the Romans in deeper and deeper, while his cavalry crushed the Roman cavalry on the flanks and turned inward. The Roman army found itself surrounded on all sides in a slowly tightening circle. Somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Romans died in a single afternoon. The Roman historian Livy wrote that so many gold rings were taken from the fingers of dead Roman knights that they were sent back to Carthage by the bushel. And yet Rome did not surrender. The Senate met. New legions were raised. Boys as young as 16 were enlisted. Slaves were freed and armed. And the Romans changed their strategy. No more pitched battles. Wear Hannibal down, let him march through Italy, saw burning and plundering, while Rome refused to give him the final battle he needed. It worked. Hannibal spent 15 years in Italy, brilliant, undefeated, and ultimately stranded. His brother Hasdrubal tried to bring reinforcements across the Alps, but was defeated before reaching him. When Hannibal finally received news of this, it was delivered by his brother's severed head, which the Romans had catapulted into his camp. Hannibal eventually returned to Africa, where a Roman general named Scipio, later called Scipio Africanus, defeated him at the Battle of Zama. Carthage surrendered. The city survived. For now. A Roman senator named Cato the Elder ended every speech he gave on any topic with the same 5 words. Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. He said it for years. He said it about agricultural policy, or about legal reform, about street repairs. Carthage must be destroyed. In 146 BCE it was. The city was besieged, street by street, for 3 years. Then it was burned. The population was enslaved. And, in a detail that may or may not be historically accurate, but which Rome clearly believed, the ground itself was salted, so nothing would grow there again. The great rival was gone. Rome now ruled the Mediterranean. They called it Mare Nostrum, our sea. Part 8. The Long Unraveling, the End of the Republic. 8 minutes. The Republic that had survived Hannibal, that had conquered the Mediterranean, that had lasted 5 centuries, how did it destroy itself? And was it one man's fault, or was something deeper falling apart? Victory, as the Romans were about to discover, can be more dangerous than defeat. So when Rome conquered the Mediterranean, it returned home with enormous quantities of plunder, slaves, and grain. The slaves worked the farms. The grain was cheap. And the small farmers of Italy, who had left their land to fight Rome's wars and returned to find their fields swallowed by large, slave-worked estates, had no way to compete. They sold their land, drifted to the cities, and became the urban poor, politically active, economically desperate, and increasingly willing to follow whoever promised them relief. Two brothers named Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus tried to address this. They were aristocrats, members of the very class whose wealth they threatened, and they used the legal mechanisms of the Republic to push land reform legislation. The Senate, threatened and furious, had Tiberius beaten to death by a mob of senators wielding chairs and table legs. Gaius, a few years later, died in political chaos, either killed or, knowing his end was coming, ordering a slave to kill him first. The Gracchi were the first symptom. After them, the medicine got stronger and stronger. Here is the lesser-known detail that historians find so haunting. Tiberius Gracchus was killed on the steps of the Temple of Jupiter by senators using furniture. The Republic did not fall to an outside conqueror. It was dismantled by its own best citizens, one violated norm at a time. Then came Marius, a military genius from a non-aristocratic family who reformed the Roman army, creating the professional, loyal to their general legions that would eventually end the Republic. Then came Sulla, who marched his army on Rome, something no Roman general had ever done, a thing so forbidden it seemed impossible, and declared himself dictator. Sulla retired eventually, which surprised everyone, but the precedent was set. You could march on Rome and win. You could make yourself dictator. You could reorganize the state. Then came the Great Triumvirate: Crassus, the richest man in Rome, Pompey the Great, who had organized the entire Eastern Mediterranean, and Julius Caesar, a politician of dazzling intelligence, a military commander of seemingly supernatural gifts, and a man with debts so enormous they would have destroyed a lesser man. Caesar's conquest of Gaul, modern France, took 10 years and was, by the standards of his own historians, an act of extraordinary violence. Yet the Roman author Plutarch estimated that Caesar killed 1 million people and enslaved another million during the Gallic Wars. He returned from Gaul enormously wealthy, beloved by his army, and politically threatened at home. His enemies in the Senate ordered him to disband his army before returning to Rome. He crossed the Rubicon instead, the small river that marked the border between Gaul and Italy. With one legion, into civil war. He won. Pompey fled and was murdered in Egypt. Caesar became the most powerful man in Rome. He was appointed dictator, not for the traditional 6-month emergency period, but perpetuo, for life. And then, on the Ides of March 15th, 44 BCE, 23 senators surrounded him at the foot of a statue of Pompey in the Senate House and stabbed him to death, while the first blow was struck by a man named Casca. The others followed. Caesar, it is said, fell against the base of Pompey's statue, wrapped his toga around himself, and died. The famous line, "Et tu, Brute," even you, Brutus, comes from Shakespeare, not from ancient sources. What Roman historians actually record is that Caesar said nothing, or that he spoke a few words in Greek, a language of private intimacy, not public theater. The silence, perhaps, is more devastating. The assassination solved nothing. Another civil war followed, then another. And from the wreckage of the last one, a quiet, cautious young man with the name Octavian emerged, and became something Rome had sworn it would never have again. Augustus Caesar transformed Rome from a republic into an empire, but he never used the word emperor. How did he do it? And why did it work so well that Rome barely noticed? Octavian was 20 years old when Julius Caesar was assassinated. He was Caesar's grandnephew, and Caesar had secretly adopted him in his will, making him his heir. He had no military experience. He was reportedly not physically strong. He had the kind of face that blended into any room. He spent the next 14 years dismantling every rival, surviving every crisis, and accumulating power so methodically and carefully that by the end, the Roman state was entirely his. And almost no one had noticed it happening. In 27 BCE, in a scene of theatrical humility, Octavian appeared before the Senate and announced that he was surrendering all his extraordinary powers. He was retiring. The Republic was restored. He was just an ordinary citizen. The Senate, in a carefully orchestrated response, begged him to stay. They granted him the title Augustus, the revered one, the holy one, and gave him command of all the provinces that had armies and the authority to conduct foreign policy. He kept the office of tribune for life, giving him the inviolable sacrosanct person of a people's tribune. He controlled the treasury. He commanded the loyalty of every soldier. He never called himself Rex. He never called himself dictator. He called himself princeps, the first citizen, first among equals. Just a very important senator, really. Nothing to worry about. The title emperor, imperator, was actually a traditional Roman military honor, equivalent to what we might call commander. Roman generals had always been acclaimed imperator by their troops after a victory. Augustus simply kept the title permanently and associated it exclusively with himself. The word emperor, which would come to mean the supreme ruler of half the world, began as a battlefield cheer. The Augustan age that followed was, by many measures, the cultural pinnacle of Roman civilization. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, would eventually stretch across 2 centuries, from Augustus's reign through the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE. The historian Edward Gibbon called this era the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. Under Augustus, the poets Virgil, Horace, Ovid, and Livy flourished. The city was rebuilt in marble, the borders were secured, the laws were reformed, the grain supply was guaranteed, and the Romans were happy to trade the chaotic freedom of the late Republic for the orderly prosperity of one-man rule. They had been fighting civil wars for 100 years. They were exhausted. Augustus died in 14 CE, aged 75, an extraordinary lifespan for the ancient world, in a town in southern Italy. His last words, according to his biographer Suetonius, were, "Have I played the part well? Then applaud as I exit." It was the most Roman thing he could have said. The emperors of Rome included philosophers and monsters, builders and destroyers. But who were the ones history has almost forgotten? And what did they do that deserves to be remembered? The emperors of Rome are often remembered in 2 groups. The famous names that even schoolchildren know, Augustus, Nero, Caligula, Marcus Aurelius, and the long list of others who blur together in memory, distinguished mainly by the manner of their deaths. But spend time with the overlooked ones, and remarkable things emerge. Consider Claudius, the 4th emperor, the one who immediately followed the infamous Caligula. He was the family embarrassment, the uncle who stammered and limped and was kept in the background because the imperial family found him undignified. Caligula made him a consul partly as a joke. When Caligula was assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard, the soldiers found Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace, terrified. They acclaimed him emperor, supposedly because they needed someone quickly. Claudius turned out to be one of the most competent emperors Rome ever had. He conquered Britain, something even Julius Caesar had failed to do permanently. He reformed the bureaucracy, built new harbors, gave Roman citizenship to provincial peoples, and was a prolific author and historian. He was also, almost certainly, much cleverer than everyone around him had ever imagined. And there are historians who suggest he had spent decades pretending to be less intelligent than he was, as a survival strategy during the murderous reigns of Tiberius and Caligula. Claudius wrote a history of the Etruscans, 20 volumes, that would be extraordinarily valuable to modern scholars trying to understand that mysterious civilization. Not a single word of it has survived. It was lost, like so much of the ancient world, in the centuries of chaos that followed Rome's fall. Sometimes the most heartbreaking thing about history is not what was destroyed, but what we know existed and is simply gone. Consider Hadrian, the emperor who built the wall across northern Britain, who traveled ceaselessly through every province of his empire, inspecting its administration, who fell deeply in love with a beautiful young man named Antinous, and, when Antinous drowned in the Nile at 18 years old, had him deified. Temples to Antinous sprang up across the empire. Cities were renamed in his honor. His face was carved into more statues than almost any figure in Roman history except the emperors themselves. And consider Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, the Stoic, the man who spent the last decade of his reign on the cold, a gray frontier of the Danube fighting Germanic tribes while writing in his private journal the meditations that still circulate today as a guide to living a good life. He never meant them to be published. They were notes to himself, reminders. One of the most haunting things about the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius is that they were written under conditions of extreme stress, plague, war, political intrigue, by a man who knew he was dying and used philosophy not as decoration but as medicine. When he writes, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He was writing it to himself on a cold night, at a military camp on the edge of the civilized world. He was reminding himself. At its peak, Rome may have been the largest city in the ancient world. What was it actually like to stand in its streets? And what could you see from the top of its hills? Let us visit Rome at its height, somewhere around the reign of Trajan, early in the 2nd century of the Common Era. The city holds somewhere between 1 and 2 million people. The estimates vary, but all of them stagger the imagination. No city in the Western world would reach this size again until London in the 19th century. Rome is genuinely, uniquely vast. 14 aqueducts bring water into the city from the hills and mountains around it. At their peak, these structures delivered over 1 million cubic meters of fresh water per day, more than many modern cities consume. The water flows into fountains on every street corner, into the bathhouses, into the private homes of the wealthy. And in a magnificent waste that is itself a kind of boast, much of it simply flows continuously through the public latrines, flushing them clean. The Forum of Trajan, completed around 112 CE, is one of the largest and most elaborate public spaces ever built in the ancient world. It contains a basilica, a great covered hall, larger than any building that had existed in Rome before it. It contains 2 great libraries, one for Greek texts and one for Latin. And in its center rises a column 100 feet tall, its entire surface carved in a spiral relief that tells the story of Trajan's wars in Dacia. A comic strip in stone, 150 meters of narrative wound around a marble shaft, still standing today. At night, the city glows. Not with electric light, of course, but with the warm amber light of thousands of oil lamps burning in windows and doorways, with the torch-lit processions of wealthy households moving through the dark streets with their retinues of slaves carrying light ahead of them, and with the sacred fires that never went out in the temples on every corner. The smell of the city is something we can reconstruct, imperfectly, from ancient descriptions. Bread baking in 1,000 bakeries, garlic and olive oil from the food stalls, the heavy sweetness of incense from the temples, the tang of the river, the sharp earthiness of fresh-cut stone from the endless construction, and underneath all of it, inevitably, unstoppably, the smell of 1 million human beings living very close together. It is not a clean smell, but it is a living one. In the question that has haunted historians for 15 centuries, why did the greatest empire in Western history collapse? Was it one cause, or something far more complicated? The fall of Rome is, in some ways, the most discussed event in Western history. Edward Gibbon wrote 6 volumes about it. Scholars have proposed hundreds of causes over the centuries. Lead poisoning in the water pipes, climate change, soil exhaustion, the adoption of Christianity, military overextension, economic collapse, political instability, mass migration. The honest answer is that Rome did not fall for one reason. It fell the way a very old building falls, not because of a single crack, but because of the slow accumulation of 100 small failures until one day the structure can no longer hold itself up. The 3rd century CE is sometimes called the crisis of the 3rd century, which is historians' understated way of saying that everything went catastrophically wrong simultaneously. In the 50 years between 235 and 284 CE, Rome had more than 50 emperors. Most of them were killed by their own soldiers. The empire split into 3 separate pieces, briefly, before being reunited by force. Plague swept through the provinces for decades. The Rhine and Danube frontiers were repeatedly breached. The economy contracted so severely that some regions went back to barter. The Emperor Diocletian, who came to power in 284 CE, stabilized things, temporarily, through brutal administrative reform. He divided the empire into East and West, each governed by its own emperor and deputy, creating what historians call the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. He reformed the tax system, fixed prices by imperial decree, and reorganized the military. Diocletian also issued the edict on maximum prices in 301 CE, one of history's most ambitious attempts at economic regulation. It set maximum prices for hundreds of goods and services across the empire, from wheat and barley to the wages of lawyers and teachers. It was posted in stone on public buildings across the empire. And it failed almost immediately because the price ceilings were set lower than actual production costs, causing goods to disappear from markets entirely. The edict is most valuable today as a remarkable document of what things cost in the ancient world. We know that a pound of pork cost 12 denarii, that a lion cost 150,000 denarii, and that a scribe who wrote in an elegant hand could charge 25 denarii per 100 lines. Constantine, who came after the chaos following Diocletian's retirement, unified the empire again and made the decision that would change Western civilization forever. He converted to Christianity and legalized it throughout the empire. Whether this caused Rome's decline is still debated. Edward Gibbon thought so. He argued that Christianity sapped Roman martial virtue and directed people's energy toward the afterlife rather than the defense of the present world. Most modern historians disagree, pointing out that Rome managed another century and a half of survival after Constantine, and that the eastern half of the empire, also Christian, survived for another 1,000 years. The Western Empire fragmented gradually, not in a crash, but in a slow withdrawal of complexity. Roads no longer maintained, cities shrinking, trade routes contracting, literacy declining. The last emperor of the Western Roman Empire was a boy named Romulus Augustulus, a name with the poignant irony of combining the city's mythical founder with its first emperor, who was deposed in 476 CE by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. There was no dramatic last stand, no final battle for the soul of civilization. Odoacer simply sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, declared that the Western Empire no longer needed an emperor, and that was that. The lights did not go out. They dimmed. Slowly. Over generations. People went on living, speaking Latin dialects that would slowly become French and Spanish and Italian, and Portuguese and Romanian. They went on using Roman roads, Roman laws, or Roman administrative structures. The church preserved Roman literacy and Roman bureaucratic tradition. The idea of Rome did not die. It transformed and transformed again, and is still transforming now. Rome fell more than 1,500 years ago. So why does it feel so close? What did this ancient city leave behind that we are still carrying with us tonight? The inheritance of Rome is so woven into the fabric of the modern world that we have almost stopped seeing it. It is like asking a fish what it thinks about water. The legal systems of most of Europe, and through European colonization, much of the world, descend from Roman law. The concepts of legal personhood, of contracts, of property rights, of innocent until proven guilty, these are Roman inventions. Every time a court weighs evidence before rendering a verdict, it is performing a ritual begun 2,000 years ago in the Forum. The languages of 500 million people trace directly to Latin, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, and English, though Germanic at its core, absorbed so much Latin through French and directly through scholarship that a significant portion of our vocabulary is effectively Roman. The months of our calendar are Roman. July is named for Julius Caesar. August is named for Augustus. The word calendar itself comes from the Latin calendae, the first day of each Roman month when debts came due. The Catholic Church preserved and transformed Roman institutional structures. The Bishop of Rome became the Pope. The diocese that had been a Roman administrative unit became a church territorial division. The vestments of priests echo the ceremonial dress of Roman officials. The church celebrated its liturgy for centuries in Latin. The Pope still speaks it. Architecture, infrastructure, military organization. The concept of citizenship, that belonging to a political community confers rights and duties, is a Roman idea, and through Rome, it became the foundational concept of modern democracy. Here is perhaps the most striking piece of continuity: Roman concrete. The Romans invented a type of concrete, opus cementicum. that used volcanic ash from the region around Pozzuoli, mixed with seawater, and actually got stronger over time as the seawater caused mineral reactions within the mixture. Modern concrete begins to degrade after 50 to 100 years. Some Roman harbor structures like those at Caesarea Maritima have been underwater for 2,000 years and are still structurally sound. Scientists are only now understanding the chemistry well enough to potentially reproduce it. We are still learning from Rome, still inheriting it. Still, in 1,000 ways we barely notice, living inside the shape it carved into the world. We have traveled a long way tonight, from the mud brick huts on the banks of the Tiber to the marble temples of the Republic, to the vast ordered empire of Augustus and Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius, to the long twilight and the quiet, unhurried transformation into something new. We have walked the streets of a city that smelled of garlic and incense and river water. We have sat in its bathhouses, eaten at its food stalls, listened to its senators argue, and its legions march and its poets write their verses in the lamplight. We have heard the names of the forgotten ones, the Etruscan women dancing in their painted tombs, the plebeian farmers who went on strike and won, the emperor who hid behind a curtain and turned out to be brilliant, the philosopher king writing to himself in the cold dark of a military camp. Rome was not a perfect civilization. It was, by our standards, a civilization of breathtaking violence and inequality, of slavery and conquest and the casual brutality of the arena. We do not need to romanticize it to be fascinated by it. What we can say is that it was alive, extraordinarily, recklessly, magnificently alive, for over 1,000 years. It made mistakes on a colossal scale and recovered from them. It built things that still stand. It thought thoughts that still circulate. It told stories that we are still telling. Somewhere beneath the streets of modern Rome, the ancient city continues. Archaeologists are still finding it. New rooms beneath already excavated ruins. New inscriptions under layers of medieval construction. New mosaics preserved in the dark, beneath centuries of accumulated earth. The city has not finished speaking. And now, it grows quiet. The Forum empties as the last light leaves the sky. The temples on the Capitoline Hill cast long shadows across the stone pavement below. The Tiber moves slowly toward the sea, dark and unhurried, the same river it has always been, carrying with it the reflections of all the lights the city has ever burned. Somewhere, a fire is dying down to embers. The eternal city rests. And so can you.